Between the early 1400s up until the late 1700s, around 90,000 people were prosecuted on the grounds of witchcraft in Europe and in the American colonies, and around 45,000 of these people were put to death. 80% of these victims were women. The witch hunt was in part fueled by a misogynistic set of ideas, and in this video I'll give a bit of background to the major proponents of the witch hunt and how sexist ideas about women made their way into myths and treatises about witchcraft. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Camilla and today we'll be talking about the Great European Witch Hunt. So there's a lot of great information out there already about the witch hunt, but I will give a brief and general description of what happened, but what I really want to talk about is the more sexist and political elements of the witch hunt, which has often been overlooked in most works detailing the hunt. So let's start off with talking about what witchcraft actually was. There were two charges that were associated with the witch trials. The first one was the act of using magic, also known as Maleficarum, and referred to the use of harmful magic. Some examples of Maleficarum could be using a doll to inflict bodily harm onto someone, performing rituals in order to cause bad harvests, or the act of cursing someone with the evil eye. Herbalism could also be viewed as Maleficarum, as witches were thought to be able to create potions or ointments to achieve higher powers. The second part was the act of making a pact with the devil. Christians of this time believed it was the devil who granted witches their magical powers, and this belief went all the way back into the 4th century. Not all witches performed Maleficarum, as some of them dedicated their time to beneficial or white magic. Examples of white magic could have been stuff like seeing the future, finding lost objects, or even healing. Although this magic was good, it was still seen as a crime in the eyes of the law, as the witch would still have had to make a pact with the devil in order to achieve her powers. So after a person was accused, they were then thoroughly interrogated, most often under torture, until they confessed to their crime. So it's obvious that these confessions were fake. There was a direct link between the amount of torture being used and the number of confessions obtained. England, for example, had restrictions on how much torture could be used, which therefore led to a lower number of witchcraft confessions. England did have other ways of testing if the accused was a witch though, one of the tests being called swimming the witch. This was when the accused would have their arms and legs bound and then they would be thrown into water. If they sank, it was proof that God's water had accepted them and they were innocent, and if they floated, it meant they were a witch. This test, however, often ended with the accused drowning, whether they floated or not. So during the interrogation, the accused would be asked to name their accomplices. There was a fear that witches organized themselves in groups and met during so-called witches' Sabbaths, and so the authorities set out to find anyone associated with the accused. The accused would then name anyone they could think of just as a way to get out of the torture that was being done to them, which then led to even more accusations and trials. This then led to a chain reaction that turned into a local witch craze that eventually died down after a while. And this was how most of the witch hunt was characterized. There wasn't like a continuous hunting going on at all times, but rather these waves that swept through villages from time to time. After the witch had been sentenced, they would most often be burnt. In some areas they were burned alive, and in others it was customary to strangle them before burning their bodies. Other areas only executed witches by hanging, but what all areas had in common was that the execution would always be done in public in front of the other villages. This was not only done to spread fear and exert control over the villagers, but also as a way to teach them about witchcraft and the danger witches posed to society. The witches' charges would be read out in public before the execution took place, and pamphlets would be passed down to the villagers that added even more detail about the crime of witchcraft. Part 2. Common Myths and Malleus Maleficarum. So the witch was not a new figure when the witch hunts started in the 14th century. Tales about night-dwelling, magical women can be found in texts all the way back to the 9th century. One of them being the pagan goddess Diana. She would ride animals across the world during the night, calling women to join her as her mistresses. This was known as the Wild Hunt. And by the High Middle Ages, the idea of a nocturnal journey led by a female goddess was spread all over Western Europe. Around the same time, there was another old belief that some women could transform into striges, which was a type of screeching owl at night to devour infant children. This belief was quite popular and shared between many different cultures, and one of the Latin words used to describe witches was the word striges. As time went on, the perception of these two myths changed, and they were fully merged by the later Middle Ages. By the 16th century, the image of the witch was fully realized, and there were two major parts to the myth of the witch. The first part was the fact that the witch would make a pact with the devil, and this is what granted her powers. I spoke about that briefly in the beginning of the video. This act was described as the witch offering herself to eternal servitude to the devil, and after the pact was made, there was a ceremony where the witch got rebaptized and was marked with the so-called devil's mark. This mark was said to be fairly small, red, and insusceptible to pain. Usually found somewhere on the body under hair. This meant that people accused of witchcraft often were shaved in search for this mark and repeatedly pricked all over their body. And the second part of the myth was that witches would gather in what was known as witches' Sabbaths. These Sabbaths would be held from time to time, and witches from all across the land would gather to feast on a huge banquet, dance naked under the moonlight, and partake in numerous orgies with the devil, other demons, and each other. The descriptions of what went on at these gatherings were absurd and included eating the flesh of newborn babies and sacrificing infants to the devil. Witches were made to represent the polar opposite of good societal morals, and cannibalism was the most immoral act that could be fathomed. To further drive this point forward, witches were often depicted as nude and sexual, something that the church found very immoral. The church had very restrictive views on sex and nudity, and even tried to control the way the population engaged in sexual acts. They tried to dictate what days of the week and in what positions people were allowed to have sex. So the Sabbath was also portrayed as being the complete opposite of human values by literally describing it as taking place backwards or upside down. The witches' mass that was celebrating during the Sabbath was said to be told backwards, with the celebrant standing on his head as he gave his sermon. And the witches danced counterclockwise while singing the choir songs in coarse, monotone voices. For witches to attend this Sabbath, which was often hosted very far away, the myth of the flying witch was created. By making the witch able to fly, one could then explain how she managed to transport miles and miles away from her home in order to attend this nocturnal Sabbath. The most common explanation to how the witch made herself airborne was that it came from a magic ointment that was applied to either a piece of wood, such as a broom, or directly onto herself. This ointment then gave the object or the witch the ability to fly. The reason that the broomstick was often mentioned as a tool witches used to be able to fly was because of its association with womanhood. During the time of the witch hunts, several artworks were created depicting witches, and in these artworks we can see many of these sort of references to womanhood. Cauldrons and cooking were popular imagery when depicting witches, as well as the spindle and distaff, which were tools used in weaving. These items and professions were heavily associated with women, and during the witch hunt, more and more female activities started to become associated with witchcraft. Some examples being cooking, gathering herbs, creating ointments, which was a common practice with wise women, but more about them later. Previously mentioned ointment was thought by some scholars to be made from hallucinogenic properties found in certain fungi and toads. However, no recipes of this ointment have been found that claims that such ingredients were being used. Also, not everyone believed in this ointment either, as there has been no mentions found of it in certain areas. Instead, they thought that the witch rode animals to attend the Sabbath, or just simply walked there. When talking about the witch hunt, we obviously need to mention the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, as it's mostly known as.
The Malleus Maleficarum.
The witch's hammer.
I've already made a video where I go through this entire book, but basically it was written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, and was one of the most influential witch treatises of its time. Several treatises concerning witchcraft were released during this time, but the Malleus proved to be the most popular, still being relevant 3 centuries after its publication. So what it was basically a guidebook on how to find witches, how witches operated, and how to properly punish them. Women were, according to the Malleus, more likely to be seduced by the devil than men because of their increased libido. Women were thought to be more weak-minded than men and driven by lust in a way that weakened their intellect. But the natural reason is that she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations. And it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent as it were in a contrary direction to a man. And since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. So these ideas didn't necessarily come from the Malleus. It was a common belief in society that women were the weaker sex, but the authors of the Malleus linked witchcraft to womanhood more forcefully than any other demonologist of that time. Also, a demonologist was basically just like a guy who studied demons and whatnot. According to the Malleus, it was the woman's sexuality that was the source of their inadequacies, and their carnal lust made them less rational and unintelligent. The devil also used women's insatiable lust to gain power over them, to make them serve him eternal servitude. The Malleus linked sorcery with female sexuality, as the book claimed that adulterous drabs and whores are chiefly given to witchcraft. Female sexuality was seen as a dangerous thing, and the author of the Malleus claimed that women would use her sexual powers to gain control over a man and work her way into higher ranks of society. If you want to know more about this book, I highly recommend checking out my other video where I go way more in depth on this book. Part 3: The political and misogynistic aspects of the witch hunt. The printing press was invented in the early 15th century, which meant that books like the Malleus Maleficarum could be produced and distributed at a greater scale than ever before. There was a correlation between the intensity of the witch hunt and the accessibility to these kinds of books, as there was a reduction of witch hunts in the early 16th century that corresponded to interruptions of publications of these books. The culmination of the witch hunt took place in the later part of the 16th century, which came around the same time that accessibility to these books became easier. However, it's unclear whether the deepened fear of witchcraft was because of this or because of the social problems that was increasing during this time. The enclosure movement in England, Revolts in France leading to starvation all over Europe, and multiple years of bad harvest all took place during the culmination of the witch hunts. It is however clear that the printing press made the witch hunt the first ever event that could be aggravated using propaganda. In addition to texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, pamphlets detailing the hunt was also spread to cities and villages. These pamphlets would go into detail who the accused witches were and went into detail of their horrendous crimes as a way to further scare the population. The political elements of the witch hunt became clearer as time went on. The first witch trial took place in the middle of the 15th century, and by the mid-16th century the witch trial had passed over from the Inquisition to the secular courts, meaning that the witch hunts were taken from the kind of religious organizations to the actual public legal courts. The witch hunt grew into an administrative action, with authorities even traveling to towns and villages to teach the residents how to recognize and fear witches. The execution of the witch was turned into a huge spectacle, with the accused being punished and killed in front of the entire village. Witchcraft was also different from other crimes by the fact that it was an inherently evidence-less crime. A thief would be charged with the specific crime of stealing something, just as a murderer would be charged with the act of having murdered something. Witches, on the other hand, were being charged on their intention of doing something, and there was no evidence needed. Most of the witch accusations consisted of rumors and speculation, and the accused reputation was often the deciding factor whether she got charged or not. Women with a so-called bad reputation were the ones that were most often accused and charged. Witchcraft was also seen as one of the worst crimes a person could commit, and unlike stealing and murder, that were crimes committed against other people, witchcraft was an offense committed against God himself. Authorities also feared organization, which led to the obsession about the witches' Sabbath mentioned earlier. The thought of having a group of people who met in secret is what led to the chain reactions, where one accused was forced to name accomplices until entire villages were wiped out. And at the height of the witch hunt, there was no denying that it was used as a way of controlling the population, especially the women. So the misogyny associated with witchcraft came from the sexism that was already established within Christianity. Ever since humanity shifted away from polytheism in order for a single deity, societies tended to become more patriarchal in nature. This can be observed by studying different cultures, as this single deity would always be depicted as male. Cultures that had multiple gods often had both male and female gods and goddesses. So when societies then moved to having only one god, the god was always male. Christian dogma is inherently sexist in its nature, especially original sin, which heavily influenced Christianity of the 13th century. Original sin is an interpretation of the creation myth that claims that women are being punished by the transgressions made by Eve after she ate the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Her punishment was to give birth in pain and to always be subservient to men. This meant that women were born already a sinner, and society viewed them as impure. Heretic sects were being created during all of this time as an opposition to the church, and offered a place for people who questioned the teachings of the church. Men and women were given the same rights and opportunities, and because of this they were deemed as heretics and hunted the same way as witches. Women were often seen as equal to men in these sects, and were given the same opportunities and a less oppressive religion for people to take part in. These heretic sects were often charged with devil worshipping, even though there was no proof to back up these claims. The way women were targeted during the witch hunt illustrate how it was used to further strip women of their rights and power within society. Witchcraft specifically was an inherently female crime, as areas that had less defined lines between heresy and witchcraft tended to charge more men than average. So heresy was just the act of being like a non-Christian, and then the act of witchcraft was obviously, being a witch. And in some places these two crimes were kind of the same thing, and in those places men were killed on a higher rate than in places where heresy and witchcraft were separated, if that makes sense. Female activities and professions came to be associated with witchcraft, such as gathering herbs and cooking, as well as midwifery and healing. The Malleus even dedicated an entire chapter about midwives and how these women would conspire together and sacrifice babies to the devil. The beginning of chapter 13 in the Malleus Maleficarum begins with the text how witch midwives commit the most horrid crimes when they either kill children or offer them to devils in most accursed wise. Women were often banned from education, meaning that wise women, the name given to women healers, got their knowledge passed down to them from their mothers, which led to authorities thinking these women were using magic. Because knowing how to heal people, you would have had to have an education to learn how to do it, and if you didn't have an education, that means that it must be magic. So these women who knew how to do these things just because they got taught by their mothers, they were like, oh, okay, that's just witchcraft, that's how that works. Fewer and fewer women were allowed to practice midwifery because of this, and starting from the beginning of the 17th century, the first male midwives started to appear. Men started to take over more and more jobs that had previously been performed by women, brewing and textile work being two other examples. Unmarried women and widows were the most likely to be accused of witchcraft. Incidentally, these women were also more likely to be financially independent from men. Married women were seen as subordinate to their husbands, and so the only way for women to have a trade of their own was to either inherit the husband's trade as a widow or remain unmarried and inherit the trade after her father. But there were other ways of using witchcraft to strip women of their power. Contraceptives and abortion started to become linked with witchcraft during the late 15th century, removing bodily authority from women. There were writings about witches using charms and other magical items to avoid pregnancy, and by the 17th century, witches were not only accused of trying to halt the reproduction of humans, but also being a part of an infanticidal sect that was devoted to the act of murdering children. So basically, witchcraft was seen as very anti-baby and was almost presented as something that was trying to halt the entire reproduction of humans, which is obviously very bad. There was also a very obvious sexual element to the myth of the witch. Women at this time were thought to be driven by their lust in a way that men weren't, and this was partly why women were seen as more susceptible to the devil's persuasion. Women without a husband were also believed as unable to control their libido, as they didn't have a husband to keep them in check. Older women that were no longer in their childbearing years were also thought to be slaves to their libido, as they no longer had pregnancy to control their lust. This just made single women all the more likely to be accused of witchcraft. The witch's relationship with the devil was also overtly sexual. It's worth mentioning the dynamic between man and magic before the witch hunt took place, as men who practiced magic were thought to conjure devils and demons as their servants. When the genders changed to women being associated with magic, the power dynamics also swapped. So basically, male magicians who conjured devils and demons were thought to be the master over the demons and the devils. However, when women started to be associated with magic and witchcraft, she was enslaved by the devil and other demons. Witches were enslaved to the devil, and their union, in which the witch swore her loyalty to the devil, shared similarities with marriage. She would be seduced by him, then they would go through a ceremony. In some cases, the witch would even change her name. Afterwards, she would give him the devil's kiss, which was an act described as kissing the devil's buttocks or genitals, and she would be branded with the devil's mark. But the witch also had a sort of duality to her. On one hand, she was described as this overtly sexual creature who lured men into their bedroom, but on the other, she was also associated with impotence and infertility. She was depicted as both a young, beautiful seductress and an old, repulsive hag. So there was a decline in the beliefs in witchcraft during the 17th century. More and more people started to believe that there were natural explanations for occurrences that had previously been attributed to witchcraft. Many diseases that was previously been blamed on witchcraft, such as epilepsy or mental illness, could now be explained by physicians. There was a new type of philosophy called mechanical philosophy that believed that the physical world functioned like a machine, and there was a need to explain things with a rational explanation. The gap between the peasantry and the elite grew even larger at this time, which led to the elite feeling a need to distance themselves even further from the peasantry. The peasantry still believed in sorcery and superstition, and that didn't change much between the 17th and 18th centuries, so the elite then felt the need like, oh, we don't believe in that silly stuff like those poor peasants do, we're smart. The last known witch execution took place in 1782. The witch hunt was instrumental in removing power and agency from women and holding back equality. Even though women have the same rights as men in most of the Western world today, it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that women gained the right to vote. In Switzerland, women weren't given full voting rights until 1971. Women have been excluded from society in a systematic way ever since men started to create men-only guilds in the 11th century. And this ostracization only grew as the witch hunt led to the killing of tens of thousands of women. Women were turned into scapegoats by the clergy and accused of being demons who committed ludicrously horrendous acts. The fact that witchcraft was an invisible crime also allowed authorities to invoke maximum amount of fear to exert control over the population. It's important to note that it was the higher-ups in society who controlled society's views on witchcraft. It was the theologians and philosophers who constructed the ideas surrounding witchcraft, and the cleric, judges, and educated landlords were the people who subscribed to these beliefs. The peasantry simply believed what the elite told them to believe. This is why the witch hunt can be seen as a political strategy to exercise authority over society, and this is also backed by the fact that the witch trials moved away from the Inquisition to the secular courts in the 16th century. As the witch hunt started off with neighbors accusing neighbors, it grew into a more administrative action. Despite all of this, the era in which the witch hunt took place is thought to be one of the most progressive in our history. It was the age of enlightenment, and even though progress for women's rights were literally going backwards, this period would be remembered and praised for its philosophical and intellectual advancements. I just want to point out that I think that's just fucking ridiculous. Like, this was a time where, you know, tens of thousands of women were being killed and women were being made out to be like this, basically, yeah, just a witch who was just set out to kill children and babies, and this was seen as like, oh, the age of enlightenment, that is the most progressive time of our history. I just think that's just bullshit. They're just like conveniently forgetting about this thing that happened to so many women. Yeah, those are my thoughts on the witch hunt. I'll post a list of books and articles in the description for anyone who wants to read more about the subject. I used a lot of research to make this video, so there's plenty of sources for anyone who would be interested. I'm also planning on making a video where I'm gonna talk about artworks depicting witches and how the image of the witch has changed during the centuries, so make sure you subscribe if you don't want to miss that. And I suppose that is the end of my video. Please like and subscribe if you like this video, and I will see you next time. Bye!